Professor Brook, with your acceptance and with your nod, should we start the conversation now?
Yes.
This is the book that we'll be discussing today, The Price of Collapse, and The Little Ice Age and the Fall of Ming China. It's a very slim book, but you can see the number of marks that all of the pages that I've put together in this. Because this is a book which is at the cross currents of different things. It talks about, of course, history of a period which is very interesting, but it also gets into a bit of climate history. It looks very interestingly at silver prices, and it brings all of this together to ascribe reasons for the failure or the collapse of an empire. Professor Brook, before we get into the book, one of the questions that everybody who looks at China has, especially around Ming, when people speak about the Ming Empire, they usually say that it failed because it was an empire which was very bureaucratic, the bureaucracy was corrupt, so on and so forth. And you do get into that in the book. But of course, you also ascribe climate change a very important reason for it. In fact, there is a quote which I'm going to get to later on. But you are a great historian of the Ming China. Your book, The Great State, I don't know if you can see it, is just behind me. It's, I think, this and the book about the Chinese map, the Mr. Seddon's map of China, are amongst my favorite books on China. I've always been fascinated. How and where do you place the Ming Empire in the long list of empires that the Chinese hold to be important? For example, Tang and Song are important empires. Where do you place the Ming? Were they just a historical aberration, or is there more to it that we need to know?
The usual way of thinking about the Ming Dynasty is that it's a period in which Chinese re-established their control of China after the Mongol occupation in the 13th and 14th centuries, and then eventually the Ming is replaced by the Manchus, who come in the 17th century. And so the usual way to approach the Ming is to say, here is a Chinese dynasty in full flower, if you like. But the more I've thought about the Ming Dynasty, the more I see it as not so much an aberration, but a shift from an occupying regime of the Mongols in the 14th century to another occupying regime of another inter-Asian people, the Manchus, in the 17th century. So I see the Ming as, it is indeed a period of extraordinary creativity, a very successful wealth creation, a period in which the bureaucracy functions reasonably well to administer the country on behalf of the people. But it is sandwiched between these two occupation regimes on either side. And if we take away those framing dynasties on either side of the Ming, we lose track of where the Ming came from and how it fell apart. And I mean, initially as a graduate student, I became very interested in the Ming. This was thanks to studying with Li Qingjia at Fudan University in Shanghai. He's the one who got me first reading late Ming literati sources. But I realized after working on the Ming for a couple of decades that if you want to understand the Ming, you have to set it in a larger context. And I've always been interested in setting China in its global context. So I started doing that back in the 1990s and spent some time studying the Jesuits as a way of trying to understand how Europe and China were interacting in that period. But increasingly in the last decade, I've realized that we need to bring in the occupation dynasties because they define much of China's history from the 13th century through to the 20th century. And without taking those into account, we tend to isolate the Ming as though it's some kind of perfect Chinese dynasty, without realizing that for people who lived in the Ming, they looked back to one thing and then they found themselves confronting another, and that changed the way in which they look at the world. So that's why more and more in my work, I try and see what is the big picture around the particular issue that I am studying. I was interested in understanding what were the economic constraints that ordinary people in the Ming Dynasty faced. So I needed to know what things cost. And so for the last 20 years, I've been slowly collecting prices from the Ming Dynasty in order to try and understand the economic livelihood of people during that dynasty. And during COVID, I was at home and I ended up writing an enormous manuscript about the history of prices in the Ming Dynasty. And then I realized that would be of little interest to anyone. I mean, it's of interest to me and perhaps to maybe a dozen other Ming specialists, but that I wasn't telling a story that would have much appeal to anyone. It was to say, well, this is what things cost, and this is how people lived their lives within this price regime. And then I rethought the manuscript that I had written, and I thought, no, let's focus on what is really the most striking discovery that commodity price data showed me during the course of the Ming Dynasty. And that was that there are certain moments in the Ming Dynasty, the 1450s, the 1530s, the 1580s, then the 1630s, 1640s. There are certain moments when grain prices, and grain prices are the most fundamental price in an agrarian economy. So grain prices just went through the roof, and they rose rapidly to very high levels. And then the prices came down at the end of a period of anywhere from 2 to 6 years. And so I realized, well, that what the grain prices are responding to are changes in the conditions under which grain is grown. And the most powerful condition in a pre-modern agricultural economy is the climate. Is the climate delivering the temperatures you need? Is it delivering the water you need? And when there is a crisis, when there is a climate crisis, temperatures either rise or fall, precipitation rises or falls. And I realized that really the most important discovery of my work on Ming prices was the way in which grain prices reflected changes in the climate from the 14th century through to the 17th century. And the model I attached my analysis to was the model of the Little Ice Age, which has been well established largely from European data, some American data, some Asian data. But I realized that the changes I was seeing in the price regime during the Ming period were directly linked to the changes in the climate. And so I decided, rather than boring readers with a great deal of data about Ming prices, what I would do is focus in on these price crises and then place these price crises within a global context, which is why I turned to the Little Ice Age.
When you open the book, there is, I mean, of course, the most important thing is the narrative that you open the book with, that is Chen Shida. But moving on from there, there is a very interesting and a telling remark, which is about Gong, the stability of prices that has to be maintained. One specific feature, which is a recurring theme of the book, is that price failure, the catastrophic price failure, or the exorbitant price that was being charged at different times, was always seen as a commentary on how the heaven was displeased with the emperor or the empire. In fact, we have a very short-lived reign of 7 years in between, which was perhaps one of the worst, but it came at a time when climate was slightly propitious. Could it not be argued that the Little Ice Age exacerbated a problem which really existed in how the bureaucracy only dealt with a very, very small subset of a larger problem? And the larger problem was often left unresolved.
Well, that's an interesting way of thinking about the interaction between nature and human society. And of course, nature doesn't simply, the climate doesn't simply act unilaterally. It acts in a way that humans will respond to these climate changes as well as they possibly can in order to survive them. And from the work I've done on the Ming Dynasty, I would say the Ming bureaucracy was reasonably good at working out responses to crisis. So if there is an ongoing drought, they will think about how do we change water supply so that the farmers get the water they need for their crops. Or if there's an excess of water, if there's flooding that is washing away the fields, the bureaucracy will step in and say, all right, we need to build infrastructure that will divert water away from the farmers' fields. And so at some level, I think the fact that the Ming got through, the fact that the Ming survived for almost 3 centuries, I think, is a sign that the bureaucracy was reasonably responsive to the needs of the people. And if it hadn't been, well, the danger, of course, is that there will be a rebellion and the regime will be overthrown. And one emperor was overthrown by the impact of the climate on his rule. But otherwise, the dynasty was able to survive all the way down until 1644. So I take a reasonably positive view of the bureaucratic response to climate crisis during the Ming Dynasty. The challenge, though, is the impact of a deep short-term crisis. If there's a long-term shift going on in the climate, farmers and officials will find ways to make adjustments to the changes that they're experiencing in the climate. The problem is when it's a severe and short-term, there's not much backup. So China did have, Ming China, the founder of the Ming Dynasty, set up a granary system that was designed to have in storage grain that people could survive on for at least 2 years if they couldn't actually grow any grain in the field. Now, it is a problem of bureaucracy that when an initiative ends, bureaucrats worry about the new initiatives and forget the old ones. So the granaries generally fell into disuse and were of not much help, although they're of help at some moments. But the granary system tended to decline, and which is why the Qing granary system was, I think, so good, because they saw what had happened during the Ming and they didn't want that to happen to them. But if you haven't got grain on hand and you can't harvest crops for 3 or 4 years in a row, you are facing a massive crisis, and no amount of bureaucratic action, I think, can respond to that in the short term. So the question is, long-term change versus short-term change, and bureaucracies are famously ill-equipped to deal with short-term crises. They can deal with longer-term crises, but the short-term crisis is the one. These are the short-term crises are the ones that tend to disturb the political situation and the economic situation at any one point in time, causing a crisis.
Professor, one of the features of the book, in fact, one of the most interesting chapters is about silver. There is an English translation of a remarkable book called The Empire of Silver by Jin Shu. She, I think, is the columnist for Financial Times in China. In her chapter on the Ming Dynasty, she writes something which is very interesting, which is about the role that paper currency played in Ming China. The founder of Ming China saw that silver can be a very hard thing to muster and master. So they shift to paper currency. In your book, and of course, the paper currency then also went out of favor very fast because inflation kept on rising very, very fast. But it makes a return during the Wanli era, if I'm not wrong. So I think it makes a return in the middle of the Ming dynasty. And the reason that was given was that the founding emperor could not have been wrong. What role do these traditional norms or mores play in these catastrophic pricing or the grains that had to be transferred from one area to another area? In fact, you call it forced pricing. So A, what role does tradition play? B, what role can be ascribed to certain institutions, especially in terms of memory or the leadership or the credibility of the previous emperors?
Well, I'll start with the issue of money. Monetary issues tended to have, ordinary people were affected by monetary policies, of course, but they didn't really, all ordinary people did was to survive within whatever the monetary system was at any particular point in time. And yes, silver became, through the 16th and 17th centuries, became increasingly the major form of currency. The problem with silver, though, was that if you needed to go and buy a small bag of rice, silver was an inconvenient form of money because you needed such a small amount to buy the rice you wanted. And so ordinary people tended to use copper coins. That's how they bought the smaller amounts. It's the wealthy who are sort of organizing their financial lives in silver terms. Ordinary people are largely using copper, and frankly, nobody was using money. Paper money was a Mongol initiative that the Ming founder thought made good sense, and paper money does make sense, but you have to have institutions to back up the value of that money. And the Ming officials couldn't figure out really how to do that effectively. So ordinary people are trying to survive using copper coins. The wealthy survive using silver. And then this led to the question of the amount of silver in circulation in the Ming economy. Now, back in the 1980s was when we first started thinking about, we in China historians first started thinking about the arrival of silver from the Spanish colonies in Central and South America into the Chinese economy, because the Spanish were extracting silver at a huge rate in Peru and Mexico. They were shipping it over to the Philippines and then using that silver to buy Chinese commodities. So a lot of silver was moving across the Pacific and moving into the Ming economy, which is why the middle chapter in the book is looking at the global silver trade. But my conclusion from that chapter is that, in fact, the amount of silver coming in terms of the overall size of the Chinese economy, was actually quite small. And that silver mostly collected in the hands of very rich individuals, that it didn't have much of an impact on the way in which the economy was operating. And I tried, for the last 50 years of the Ming, I was trying to find examples of how the newly arriving silver might have been pushing prices up. And that, in fact, became a sort of convention starting in the 1990s of saying, well, one of the reasons the Ming dynasty falls is that it was addicted to Spanish silver, and when the Spanish trade was interrupted in the 1640s, the dynasty fell. And my view is that it's an interesting global connection to think about, but that it's not sufficient to explain what was happening in prices. And prices were not really going up through the 1620s and 1630s until the climate crisis set in, and then they start to shoot up through the roof. So So my sense is that and this is one of the challenges, I think, of writing history so many centuries in the past. What interests me is less what the elites are up to than what ordinary people are doing in order to try and survive under the conditions that they face. And so as I thought more about them rather than the elites, I felt that the silver coming in from the Americas was not having much of an impact on their lives. Now, the one area of the economy that I did feel that I detected the impact of this newly arriving silver was the art market, which is, of course, an art market that the super wealthy participate in. They had so much excess silver on hand that it drove the price of art sky high. But it's only in that small part of the economy that you feel the impact of Spanish silver on the economic lives of ordinary people. So I included that chapter on the global silver trade just to sort of set at rest that argument. And I mean, I feel like that was thinking about the global flow of silver was a major turning point in linking China to the global economy. And I support that approach very strongly. But I just don't think you can attribute price rises at the end of the dynasty to the influx of foreign silver into the Ming economy.
That is an interesting observation, and there is something on the silver that I would come back to. But what was interesting in the way that you try to define middle class, or rather say poor, that middle group, let's say, between the poor and the rich, the ultra rich, who are participating in this new art economy. In fact, the extract of the art dealer coming in the boat, and then one person finding an art piece made in a kiln, so prohibitively expensive. And then there is a comment. That is a very interesting thing. But before that, you actually put a price on below which people are poor and above which you have some sort of an elite, let's put it like that, who can be assessed. And that is very interesting. That price is one tael of silver. Beyond one tael, at two tael, you have people who can afford the luxuries in life. Below that, you have people who are poor, who are working in, who are laboring. They could be farmers. They are getting into all kinds of trades. When you look at the large enterprise, that was the Ming China, one very important remembrance, or one very important feature of that time, was the Mings were always at war. They were always trying to expand something. They were always trying to protect something. And there would be these moments when you had a lot of soldiers moving from one place to another. And I thought that soldiers would be paid well. But in your book, they actually are very squarely under the one tael mark. What role did this play in the social disunity, or the social fractiousness which spread through the entirety of the Ming Empire? And
well, you ask a question that is difficult to answer, because the voices of the people who lived on one tael a month, their voices are very difficult to find in the sources that survive. And in fact, my best sources for some of this were Jesuit missionaries who were in China and who were intrigued to understand, how does this society work? And so they took extensive notes. And some of this material was simply archived and is now available to us. Some of it was published. And I mean, one of the strongest impressions that a Jesuit who was shipwrecked along the Chinese coast in the 1610s, one of his insights was that this country is very wealthy, but most people are very poor. And it was a puzzle that he tried to sort out. And I don't think it's all that big a puzzle. I think Europe in the 17th century probably was populated by mostly very poor people and had very wealthy states and very wealthy elites. But I included this kind of information in the book because I wanted people to have a sense of what the impact would be if the price of rice soared to a level that somebody who had only a tale of silver a month to live on, what could they afford? Could they possibly get through the month with the grain that they needed in order to stay alive? And it was far beyond the reach of most ordinary people.
So in the accounts that you have of the Jesuits and the account that you quote later on, the Matteo. So in all of this, the sense that comes up is that the Ming Empire was beset with famine and was beset with other things that we can now ascribe to the Little Ice Age based on the data that we have. Yet, and this is something that I've tried to understand, Little Ice Age was not just a phenomena that was restricted to China. It was a global phenomenon. And yet, of course, 17th century is called the age of catastrophes. But in Europe, in other parts of what today would be called the Western world, it did not really have that huge of a social unrest or an impact as one would glean from your pages. Because
well, I think I was helped towards the insights in the book by thanks to Jeffrey Parker's book, Global Crisis, which is a study of the impact of Little Ice Age on Europe in the middle decades of the 17th century. Now, I know Jeffrey, and I've talked to him and thought with him for years. And in his view, the disruption in Europe was greater than we now realize. I mean, the classic example has to be the English Civil War, in which the people supporting Cromwell executed Charles I, and then their regime collapsed, and then England went through an enormously difficult series of decades in the middle of the 17th century. But other parts of Europe did too. Regimes collapsed, rulers were overthrown, people rose up. And I think we've rather played down the crisis of the 17th century in Europe. And now that I see the intensity of the crisis in China, I think we might be in a position to start maybe rethink a little bit what the 17th century was about, and we can't tell that story without climate change.
But would it be possible to tell that story only in terms of 17th century, or would it also have to encompass, the
yes,
century after that?
Well, the Little Ice Age wasn't one terrible event. It was a series of events starting in the 14th century, and then the world would get colder, and then it would ease up, and then it would get colder again. So the Little Ice Age was in fact a kind of a series of events rather than a single event, and it just happened to affect China most harshly in the 17th century, and that has something to do with the nature of Chinese agriculture. Leroy-Ladurie famously, when he first studied the Little Ice Age in Europe, famously noted that for Europe, the crisis was colder temperatures and excessive rainfall. And the reason the rainfall is excessive is that the colder temperatures are changing climate patterns. Well, China's experience in this period is colder temperatures and drought. So, in fact, China and Europe are experiencing the Little Ice Age differently because of the particular conditions of each of those parts of the world. And in the case of rice, a lack of water is catastrophic for you to be able to harvest a crop. Whereas in Europe, which had a more mixed economy, relied more on animal protein than grain protein, and then had a whole range of grains that could tolerate excessive water and excessive drought. Europe was perhaps not as badly hit as China was because of China's reliance on rice, which requires a certain amount of precipitation, and if the rain doesn't fall, there is nothing to eat.
Professor, one of the things that starts when you start reading the book, and it kind of goes with you throughout the book, is the availability of different food grains. You talk about when the book opens up, Shenchida is talking about how everything was plentiful in one particular year and a certain amount of money would get you things, and it was pretty plentiful. And then comes that one terrible year, and after that, things take a bad turn. In fact, he stops his book at a point of time, and then when he takes it up, things, instead of improving, have actually deteriorated more. In this backdrop, and throughout the book, different people keep on coming in to tell you about what is available. I think that is a fascinating feature of the book, because we are getting accounts from people of China, but we're also kind of reading about what's happening, what Loyola is writing to the governor in Philippines, so on and so forth. But what about the dietary pattern? In these long years of famine, crop failures, rice, which is one of the most important food grains, but it also requires a lot of water, which was not available. What was there a specific change in the dietary pattern that you've been able to record in the Gazette years that you could look up?
That would be a research project that someone could undertake, but I haven't done it. And you're right. You would go to the local gazetteers. You would see what plants and crops they were recording. And but it would be a real challenge to actually track long-term changes in the dietary foods that people were relying on. It would be an interesting project to do, but it's not something that I did. My sources, I was interested more in defining the periods of crisis, not so much in excavating all of the impacts of these crises.
The reason I'm asking, Professor, this question is because one of the features that came out, I think you indirectly refer to it, is the famine got a version of pandemic that we are seeing, and that has had a huge influence on Chinese history. I think the Chinese history in this regard has been largely unlucky. So what I was trying to understand is that are there specific areas that could be looked at with some depth, and what was the central Ming authority trying to do in trying to control these situations which were going out of hand? Because forcing price and transfer of pricing would not really help here, would it?
No, it wouldn't. So the areas that are best documented, it's the lower Yangtze region, Shanghai, Hangzhou, Nanjing, that area, because it was both a large producer of grain and a large consumer of grain. The other area for which we have pretty good data is the Beijing area, because it was the national capital, and the stability of the national capital was a hugely important political task. I've done some work on the pandemics that struck North China, but I'm afraid I really haven't done the research to understand that there are references to pandemics in the Yangtze Valley, but I haven't done that research. And this is complicated by the fact that we're still waiting for good bioarchaeology in order to understand the diseases that may have been causing the pandemics. So it's a subject that interests me, but I did not do sufficient research to be able to bring it in to the narrative in the book. The Chinese government was certainly aware of pandemics, and they tried to institute to set up things like free pharmacies so that people who were sick could go and get whatever medicines were available. The difficulty, of course, is that if it's something like the plague, there's very little medical intervention that was available in the 17th century. But if it's other kinds of perhaps famine-related diseases, there are ways of treating these diseases. But it's again, this is something that I haven't done the research on.
Well, the book is pretty remarkable in kind of getting one to look and try to come up and imagine what could have happened. But now I'm going to kind of get to a feature of the Ming administration, which was trying to defer any impact of famine. And on page 30, you have a very interesting account, which is the emperor talking with his chief grand secretary. And I'm going to be quoting it verbatim so that people who are going to be watching it later and people here can get a better sense of this. Yesterday, we were looking at Jimin Tushuo, an album of the famished. The imperial consort was in attendance. What are these pictures? She wanted to know. They show corpses and people drowning themselves. This is an album of pictures of famished people in Henan province, which Supervising Secretary Yong Dongming, the Ministry of Justice, submitted to us. After this, they kind of put together a relief campaign where the imperial consort also donates a significant amount. And then every person in the imperial bureaucracy above a certain grade is asked to give part of their salary. Later on in the chapter, you say that this was actually not that bad a famine that was shown to them. And this was very interesting. This is somewhere 150 years after the founding of the empire. There is a reason why this is of interest, because the emperor wanted the consort to be given a particular status, which was causing a lot of friction. What does this dialogue tell us about the Ming's bureaucracy to control prices and defer famine? Was it an expectation or knowledge that any famine could unseat them for power? Or was it some amount of benevolence that they really thought that they have to exhibit to the last person in the empire?
I think it's probably a combination of both factors. That at one level, the ruling family realizes that it needs to deliver stability and survivability to ordinary people. But at the same time, the emperor at that point, he's a young man. He's been on the throne. Well, he came onto the throne as a young teenager. He's been on the throne for, what, a dozen years at this point. He wants to be seen as a benevolent ruler. And he's been presented with a crisis that he thinks sort of obligatory donations from the royal family and from the upper bureaucrats can resolve. Now, I include the story because there had been a massive famine 6 or 7 years before this. And it was the first Wan Li era famine that created a massive crisis in the country. Now, that downturn in the climate only lasted for 2 years. And so the Ming was able to come back from that with reasonable success. But the fact that another downturn was occurring 6 years later, I think, is what put the emperor on alert. He realized we went through this awful famine in the late 1580s, and now here we are in the 1590s, and it looks like it's going to happen again. What can I do to prevent this from happening? So it's both I think the emperor trying to play the role of a benevolent ruler, but also in a more practical sense, concerned that another crisis on the scale of the crisis in the 1580s could create massive instability. And but he doesn't, it's interesting, he doesn't talk about that. He presents himself and the imperial consort as benevolent people who are going to use the resources available to them in order to stop the crisis. And as a political move, it works quite well, because as I said, and as I tell that story, the famine in Henan province wasn't quite as bad as Yang Dongming had represented it as being, but he too, as an official from Henan province, was panicked over the idea of going through something like the famine of 1587, 1588. He was terrified of having to go through that experience again. And so he thought, if I can present a worst case scenario to the emperor, maybe he'll respond. And in fact, he did. Now, the way in which the response that was more successful than simply raising money and buying up grain was mobilizing grain merchants to bring in the grain that was needed in the areas that were struck by famine. And this is what the officials on the ground did in Henan. They created incentives for grain merchants, to bring in grain from several provinces away, to bring grain over quite a large distance into the area that is struck by famine. And it was really the officials using incentives for the merchants that solved the problem. It was less what the imperial family had donated. And I point that I'm stressing that now because I don't think we can tell the story of the Ming Dynasty solely in terms of what its emperors did. There was a large bureaucracy, a largely functional bureaucracy, and they had means at hand to be able to ameliorate the situation. But as I said earlier in our conversation, it's when a short-term crisis starts lasting for longer than 3 or 4 years, that's when there are insufficient resources to respond. So the famine in Henan in 1594, it was a short-term crisis, it was localized, they were able to deal with it, and they dealt with it on the strength of their experience of getting through the famines of the late 1580s.
But the famine makes a comeback, and even there, the bureaucracy faces trouble. I'm going to take a step back and bring in another sort of an observation, or rather an observation deck, with your permission. We just had Yasheng Huang with us last week. And Professor Huang, as you are aware, he has written a book called The Rise and Fall of the East, Exam, Autocracy, Stability, and Technology. In that, he specifically mentions about how the examination system, and you have also spent some time talking about the examination system, the palace exams. And that was fascinating because I had to read that book for the conversation, and then I was reading this book. In fact, I read this book twice. And there are still bits that I don't understand because I'm not a trained historian. One specific thing is that you kind of go out of your way. You mentioned about two good mandarins of the time. You kind of get into their precedents. They were not qualified enough to take the palace exams, the highest degree. They were good administrators. The inflexibility of the bureaucracy could be the reason for the failure of dealing with later long-term famine, as we have seen.
It's a reasonable hypothesis, and you're right. I tended to focus not at the upper levels of the bureaucracy, But the officials who are down at the county level, the officials who are interacting with the people and providing the conditions for their survival. And so that interested me more than what's going on at the upper levels of the bureaucracy. I'm not sure how you test for that. Certainly, there is a kind of trend, there has been a trend within Chinese historiography to focus on the bureaucracy and at times to blame the bureaucracy for China's inability to respond flexibly to new problems. But I think that's really tied up with a historiography that was popular 70 or 80 years ago when, excuse me, when scholars were trying to understand, they were working with Max Weber's model of bureaucracy, and they were trying to understand, well, if bureaucracy worked so well in Europe, why did it not work as well in Asia? And it was something of a false polarization, I think. But it was a concern that scholars took up back in the 1930s and 1940s. And I'm perhaps less persuaded by it because I feel that the way to understand a bureaucracy is to understand how the bureaucracy interacts with people down at the bottom end of the bureaucracy rather than what's going on further up. And of course, people at the top, they're going to be pursuing their own power, they're guarding their own wealth, they're promoting their own proteges, and all the corruption that you would expect is going on. But I'm not sure of the extent to which that corruption has interferes with the ability of the bureaucracy to respond. And this is now leading me over into another area that I've been concentrating on over the last few years, and that is state administration during the Ming Dynasty. And in fact, I'll have a book coming out next year in which I brought several scholars together, and we talk about what goals does the Ming state set for its administrators, and how well do they respond to those goals? And our findings were generally positive, that China didn't have a bureaucracy simply to line the pockets of the elites, that the bureaucracy actually had consistent policies. These policies were reasonably consistently carried out to the benefit, and that China benefited from its bureaucracy rather than being hampered by it. So I think I'm taking a kind of different, I'm taking a different perspective on the question of bureaucratic administration than your question has posed.
That is absolutely fine. There was this question on silver and Japan, because it's not just Spain that is responsible for it. It's also Japan. Japan plays a very crucial role in all of this. Ray Huang, in writing about 1587, A Year of No Importance, kind of makes this clear. We have the Toyotomi Hideyoshi in Japan, who has constantly talked about the war that the Japanese shogunate was trying to wage on trying to win over Korea and then trying to get into the Ming Empire. What role did Japan play in creating situations which would exacerbate the crisis around silver in this part of the world? And second, in creating a situation where the Ming armed forces were constantly challenged by the Japanese. In fact, in the 1587 war, the Japanese mustered around 300,000 soldiers, and the Ming could only, in fact, they had mercenaries from Siam, that's Thailand, and they still only had 100,000 people coming in. So what role did the expansionist Ming Empire play in the background of the Little Ice Age, the famine, the drought? And yet, as I tried asking you earlier, the expansionary foreign policy. Any comment?
I'm going to answer this in two ways. One, first of all, the question of Japan. That's the role that Japan played in all of this is not something I touch on in the book, but it's certainly worth asking because Japan was a major source of silver. Japanese merchants were very keen on trading with China. The Ming would not allow Japanese to come ashore, so they had to trade in offshore islands, led to a lot of piracy, a certain amount of corruption. And then there was the pressure from Japan to take Korea away, not take it away from the Ming, but Korea acknowledged the Ming as a kind of its superior, and Japan wanted
the vassal state.
Yeah, and so Japan had designs on Korea. China had to come into Korea in order to defend Korea against the Japanese. That was hugely expensive. It was also a drain on military resources. You're absolutely right there. But I think if I'm going to I will step back from this question a little bit and perhaps rethink the question about whether the Ming was expansionist. The Ming in its first century was very much expansionist because the founding Ming emperor imagined himself to be the equivalent of somebody like Kublai Khan, and the Ming political imagination was very much shaped by the Mongol occupation, and the Mongols wanted to establish a great state that acknowledged no sort of outer limits to state power. And so the early Ming, the Hongzhi Emperor, or the Hongwu Emperor, excuse me, in the 1360s, 70s, later the Yongle Emperor at the beginning of the 15th century, these men are imagining China as another kind of expansive great state on the Mongol scale. But when the Ming Emperor Zhengtong is captured by Mongols in 1449, this causes a kind of huge shift among Chinese bureaucrats and as well within the royal family. And the Ming decides that for the rest of the dynasty, it will no longer engage in the expansionist policies of the founder or the founder's son Yongle. So that by the time we're into the 16th century, the Ming is protecting its borders, but it's not going beyond its borders. It's not trying to take other territory. Now, when Korea appeals to the Ming for support against Japan, the Ming, by virtue of its foreign policy arrangements, has no choice, but it has to go in and protect Korea from Japan. But it has no designs on Japan itself. It just wants to push Japan back. So if the Ming had been more expansionist, the arrival of, or the growth of trade around the South China Sea in the early 17th century might have been a moment of opportunity for the Ming to become more involved as a regional power. But generally, the attitude of bureaucrats during this period is, no, we strengthen the borders. We don't go out and act in a way that's going to change the power disposition elsewhere in East Asia. We strengthen our borders. We impose strict protocols on foreigners arriving in the country. We impose strict protocols on Chinese merchants who are also trading abroad. So the Ming really in the last century and a half of the Ming, the dynasty is not expansionist, but is protectionist. And possibly if they'd been in a more dynamic, sort of had a kind of worldview that was a more dynamic and expansive one, they might have been able to survive the crisis better than they did.
Thank you, Professor. That brings me to my second last question before I open it up to people gathered here for about 10-15 minutes. In this book, when you are trying to put Little Ice Age, the prices together, you have a very interesting perspective towards it. you are not just looking at prices, you're also looking at a whole lot of narrative bits. You're looking at stories, you're looking at gazetteers, so on and so forth. What would be the basis of trying to look at the Little Ice Age in terms of global trade? Because right around the time that this was happening, and we have a whole lot of stuff, as you just pointed out, that perhaps 17th century is not that well understood in terms of what it did to the lack of cohesion in Europe, and definitely China. How do we place trade in this? Because it's not just the transfer of commodities from one end to another, but it was also transfer of knowledge. You have a lot of people here who you refer to. How do we place this in turbulent climate history? How do we locate trade as the great equalizer or a creator of opportunities?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure I have a neat way of responding to it. But trade, certainly when there are crises of production caused by climate change, trade is going to be one way to respond to that. You trade for what you sell what you've got in order to trade for what you need. Now, that said, trade in the 17th century, global trade in the 17th century, at least in Asia, is not really dealing much in food commodities. There is some food going from China out to the Philippines. I'm not sure there's any food coming from the Philippines back to China. So, but trade does become an opportunity to generate wealth, and then that wealth can be used for, well, alleviating famines or altering the conditions under which people are trying to survive. So there is a role for trade in generating greater wealth at a time when people are hugely pressed to survive. But I think I haven't read anything that attempts to create an analysis of the relationship between the Little Ice Age and global trade. I think it's a wonderful question. I'd love to see what a scholar who was perhaps better trained in economics than I am, or even in climate than I am. I mean, I have to admit, I'm not an economic historian, and I'm not a climate historian. I'm a historian of how people live and survive. And I use the tools that colleagues in other areas have made available to me. As you'll notice, my book doesn't have a lot of charts and tables and that sort of thing. And it would be a delight for me if somebody who had a finely grained understanding of climate history, trade history, economic history, were to take my data and see what they could further do with it. I would be delighted to see someone do this. What I've done instead is work with the material that I feel competent to work with. So the records, the local records, the narrative materials that I have used to write the book. And I've written the book, I have to say, I've written the book not as a kind of high scholarly production. The book is really a series of insights based on my readings in Chinese history. And I've written it in a way to try and make it accessible to people who aren't specialists. So it's somebody who wants to do a full-out research-based scholarly volume covering the same events that I have. I'd be delighted to see it.
Thank you. Well, I think that would be an interesting, I would be willing to read it because I found this extremely interesting. The last question before I open it up to people who are here. And this is a question which would be slightly speculative. So if you think that that's a question, you don't want to deal in it, it's absolutely fine. When we talk about Little Ice Age, and you mention Little Ice Age, but you also use terms like climate change and anthropomorphic sometimes in the book. Is there, and you kind of desist from making any comments about what is happening right now. And yes, this is dealing with a pre-modern economy, and we are, quote unquote, a modern economy. Is there something that we could take up from this turbulent period in Chinese history and perhaps use it as a guidepost in how we deal with global climate change now? Not the Little Ice Age. But
yes, it's a very good question. And I perhaps don't have the competence to answer it at a high level, but what I would say is that climate change can have considerable impact on agriculture, which in turn then affects the amount of food that's available for people to survive on. And if we get into extreme short-term climate change, we potentially face an extreme food crisis. Now, we're not there yet, but with global warming has generally encouraged plant growth. But if global warming suddenly shot up at a much faster rate or collapsed, we as a planet would be facing some serious challenges to our food supply. And I think because we live in a modern food production system, we think that we've insulated ourselves from these kinds of factors, but ultimately we haven't. And I think one of the reasons why it would be wise for the world to continue to think more closely about climate change is the impact that it could have on food production. And that could be a serious consequence of further change in climate.
thank you, Professor Brook, for writing the book. I think I'll have to read it for a third time to gain some more insights, because I'm not a historian of China, but this has really kind of opened and extended my own boundaries. I think with what I've gleaned about Chinese porcelain from this book, and from what I got about Chinese porcelain in Vermeer and the Netherlandish painting, that would be an amazing continuity of this conversation. But thank you so much for doing it.
Well, and thank you for your interest. I found this interview highly stimulating.